In the heart of Africa, a ramshackle army learns the techniques of guerrilla warfare. But these men are not fighting against European domination. Their enemies are 10 million Arabs, their fellow citizens, in the Sudan. For the past 10 years, the Sudan's been torn by a civil war so little reported that its bitterness and brutality have gone largely unnoticed by the rest of the world. The conflict springs from the divisions of race, language and religion among Sudan's 16 million population. In the north, around the capital, Khartoum, live the Arabs, who dominate every sphere of public life. In the south are over 5 million impoverished Negroes, mostly either pagan or Christian. For centuries, the Arab majority regarded the Negro minority as little more than slaves. Eventually, a handful of southern politicians, convinced the Negroes would have to fight for their rights, organized a guerrilla force from which today's rebel movement developed. 3 years ago, the guerrillas set up their own political organization independent of Khartoum. Assembled here in front of a hut which serves as a parliament are ministers of the present rebel government of the south. They call themselves the Nile Provisional Gov't, or NPG for short. They were chosen from members of parliament who were elected by the people of the southern states in their own general elections in 1967. The NPG claims to represent all the main tribal groups in the south. This camp at Bongo in the Sudanese interior is the capital of the so-called Nile state. It's only 20 miles away from a military camp housing central government troops. That the rebel capital can exist so close to such a camp illustrates why the civil war has dragged on for so many years. Khartoum's forces control the towns and a few other strongholds, but the rebels are masters of the jungle. The guerrillas have replaced the old emblem of South Sudan with their own flag. On this occasion, in front of NPG President Gordon Mayen, it's being raised for the first time. Mayen is a Dinka tribesman. He used to be a minister in Khartoum, but became disenchanted with the way successive governments treated the South. At first he wanted autonomy. Now he's demanding full independence. This ceremony may appear naive, but for these men it symbolizes a newfound dignity as citizens of an independent state.
My colleagues, the ministers of the NPG, the raising of the new flag just bring about two changes, the change of the colors and the change...
The president's speech illustrates another element in the Sudanese drama. There are more than 100 tribes in Sudan and as many dialects. To understand each other, they must either speak English, like the president, or Arab, like the commander-in-chief, who also acts as translator.
The convention sitting at Belgo Bindi in March 1969 ruled that the former Southern Sudan is known as the Nile state, a state which is still being occupied by our enemy, the Arabs.
In evolving new institutions and new patterns of behavior in their own state, the southern tribesmen have modelled themselves on the British, once their colonial rulers. Britain administered the southern provinces as a separate colonial territory from the rest of Sudan, and British influence is still much in evidence. The ponderous ceremonial of the military review has an unmistakably British flavour, and is carried out even to the extent of deliberately neglecting a guardsman who's fainted on parade. Christianity, too, is a legacy from the colonial era. European missionaries were among the first people to bring any kind of modern education to the tribesmen of the South. There are people on both sides who present the conflict as a basically religious war and who think in terms of holy crusades. But President Mayen has refused to commit his provisional government to this point of view. Within the rebel movement as a whole, however, there are other important differences of approach. We asked Mr. Mahan what the main ones were.
The basic difference are that the NPG has the nationalist approach, whereas the others have the tribalistic approach. The NPG believes in integration of liberation forces and the political structure as the only effective way of achieving liberation quickly.
Mr. Barry Wangi holds the post of Foreign Secretary in the Provisional Government. He sees the NPG as a revolutionary party and believes that Khartoum's claim to be a socialist government is no more than an empty cliché.
Politically and ideologically, the NPG is a revolutionary leadership. We are revolutionaries in the sense that we don't believe in halfway solutions, but we are out to replace the political, economic, and cultural colonial system imposed by Arabs on our people. As such, we are revolutionaries and using revolutionary methods. There is an obvious danger in many governments using socialism as a slogan to exploit and suppress their own people. Also, some governments, like that of Khartoum, they are trying to use it as a cliche to suppress the Nilean people. Arab nationalism as practiced in Sudan can only mean the suppression of the African one. It is a conspiracy to silence our revolution.
Left, right, left, right, left, right, bow, stand.
Despite such nationalistic utterances, the guerrillas' military power is in fact very limited. The rebels have few modern weapons and training is carried out with wooden sticks, reminiscent of the early days of Biafra's army in the Nigerian Civil War.
At front, bow, stand. Stop it.
What the NPG has got is a considerable supply of men. It claims to have the support of more than 1 million of Sudan's black population. These two horsemen are scouts from the Dinka tribe, which volunteered its own fighting force to help the NPG struggle against the central government. The remainder of the force, some 1,000 men, arrived at Bongo in small groups. In 4 weeks, they'd covered 1,000 miles on foot. The Dinkas are famous on 3 counts. Their height, 6.5 feet on average, their warlike accomplishments, not even the British managed to pacify them, and the fact that their culture doesn't admit the notion of a chief. Relations and friends who'd not seen each other for months were reunited, but after the initial joy they swapped sadder stories of skirmishes with government troops in which villages had been destroyed and crops and livestock lost. The journey of the Dinka force had taken its toll on the tribesmen, many of whom were on the point of exhaustion when they arrived at NPG headquarters. A quick count was made of all those still with strength enough to fight. But the Dinkas' biggest problem was food. Their normal diet is milk, meat and millet. But at this camp there was nothing but yucca, a root which they don't know and which provides little nourishment anywhere. Malnutrition is one of the greatest problems facing the rebels. They claim that Arab troops deliberately slaughter livestock and burn crops as part of a policy of genocide. Certainly between 1963 and 1967, successive governments in Khartoum seemed bent on suppressing all resistance in the south by the most brutal use of military force, and stories of atrocities mostly date from this time. No one knows how many have died in the war, The rebels claim it's over 300,000. Khartoum admits to 20,000. And at least 200,000 refugees have fled across the border to neighbouring Uganda and the Congo. In this camp, TB and tropical ulcer are widespread. The ulcer cuts into the leg, exposing the bone. Frequently, gangrene sets in. Skilled medical help is almost non-existent among the guerrillas. There are no drugs, medicines, or even bandages at Bongo, and undressed wounds remain wide open to countless other infections from the atmosphere. This man is a nurse, the only one among the rebels who has even a rudimentary knowledge of medicine. But he's incapable of displacing the bullet lodged in a wounded man's shoulder. Although the Sudanese conflict has been generally free from outside influences, the NPG has recently hired the services of a French mercenary who plans to build an airstrip to fly in all kinds of supplies. He's also in charge of a training program for special squads of commandos. The past 18 months has seen a slackening in the intensity of the war, and there have been fewer skirmishes between guerrillas and government troops. This is almost certainly due to a new attitude in Khartoum, where General Nemeri's government seems to have accepted that a political rather than a military solution will have to be found. General Nemeri has appointed a Minister of Southern Affairs, announced a development program for the South, and declared his willingness to grant the 3 southern provinces a large measure of autonomy. But the tragedy of Sudan could be that these concessions have come too late to change southern attitudes. For NPG's President Mayen has said, 1 million patriotic dead separate us and the Arabs forever.